Leo here for Actualized.org. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about Correcting the Stigma of Psychedelics, Part 2. All right, let's continue where we left off with Part 1. If you haven't seen Part 1, go do that. There I talked a lot about psychedelics and historical and cultural contexts from all around the world. I also talked about the many medical applications of psychedelics, which are legitimate, scientific, and clinically demonstrated medical benefits. In this part, what I want to do is I want to start to unravel this demonization, get at the heart of this stigma, and to demonstrate that, first of all, that it is there, because a lot of people are in denial about the fact that psychedelics are stigmatized. They think that, no, Leo, psychedelics are not stigmatized, that's just how they are. No, it's a stigma, and not only is it a stigma, but it's a deliberate stigma, which I want to show to you. And then we're going to talk about why this stigma exists and what some solutions for it might be. So let's start with this issue of the stigma actually being a conscious, premeditated thing that society has constructed. It's not an accident, and there's some very good underlying reasons for why this is the case. And what I want to present as evidence number one, this is perhaps the most outrageous piece of evidence that I've ever come across in all my research. It just blew my mind when I read this quote, and I want to read it to you because it's really amazing. This is a confession from the Nixon administration and Watergate co-conspirator John Ehrlichman. This was long after the Nixon administration. He was now at the end of his life, and this is an interview that he gave in 1994 to Harper's Magazine. And here's what came out in that conversation, and they were specifically talking about the drug war, the war on drugs, and how it got started and why it got started. So here's what he said. The Nixon administration, the Nixon campaign of 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with cocaine, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes, break their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. End quote. The source for this is Harper's Magazine, an article called Legalize It All. And I actually made a blog post on my blog a while back. Maybe I'll link it under this episode so you can read this if you want, and you can actually click on the link to Harper's Magazine. It's an online article you can go read. Pretty amazing stuff. So this goes to show you that definitely there's a stigma around drugs. This drug war is not just some accidental or benevolent impulse from the government to keep our kids safe from drugs. It's a lot more nefarious than that. Now, of course, you might say, well, Leo, yeah, I mean, in this case, the Nixon administration was corrupt, and maybe they did push the drug war too hard. But if we look globally, we look at other countries, they also stigmatize and criminalize psychedelics and other hard drugs. So how do you explain that? I mean, surely the Nixon administration wasn't responsible for the whole drug war, because the drug war really goes on all around the world, not just in the United States. And that is true to some extent. Many countries around the world, especially first world countries, do make it illegal to consume psychedelics. Of course, laws do vary from country to country. Certain countries are more progressive and more lax with their laws. Others are more stringent. That's true. But the reason that is because the underlying motive, which was compelling the Nixon administration to start this war on drugs, is really the same motive that every government and every society faces all around the world, especially these days when we're living in a sort of globalized first world, highly consumerist and materialist economy. Capitalist systems are the lifeblood of every nation these days, almost without exception, even in Eastern countries. And so the problem here is that psychedelics, what they do is they question this entire paradigm. They question the status quo of culture, of society, of capitalism, of government. So it's really the fox guarding the henhouse. Government is not your friend. It's not some benevolent angel that is sitting there and trying to protect your kids and is trying to do the best for you, the best for your mind, the best for your consciousness, the best for your personal development. It's not trying to create the most conscious human beings, as if it wasn't obvious already at this point. See, culture is not your friend. Culture's job is to seduce you into getting so sucked into the reality of culture, which is a fiction, it's an illusion, so sucked into it that you just go along without questioning anything and you just become part of the herd. That's what culture is about. And then, of course, culture is architected and engineered, and all the government systems are architected in such a way that the power flows up to the top. It's all about control of power. That's what it's about. And of course, psychedelics are antithetical to all of this, because what psychedelics show you is they showed you the more compassionate, softer side of life and higher consciousness. At higher levels of consciousness, you can no longer lie and cheat and steal and disproportionately accumulate power and manipulate the way that governments love to do to maintain the status quo. Psychedelics also question all cultural norms, all traditions, all the conservative values and agendas that conservatives cling to and love and hold so dear. All of that is questioned. And culture and government are highly biased towards conservatism, in the same way that your mind is biased towards conservatism. Nature generally is biased towards conservatism, because if something works in nature, it tends to have a homeostasis to it. That means that if something is working, your mind or the cells in your body or whatever, a species, a population of anything, a business, a corporation, a government, it wants to maintain that. But then if you study history, you see that there's a problem in that you have this conservative force of homeostasis trying to keep things the same, but then also you have the force of evolution, which is always moving towards progress, and things are changing. And so you always have this tug of war between the old and the new. And how do you reconcile these two? Because if you have too much new coming too quickly, it's too revolutionary, you can't cope with the change, and you sort of self-destruct. And there are risks with going in new directions, trying out new things, whether it's in business or in your family life or in your personal life or as a society. There's risks with new technology, with new developments. And there's risks when a species is trying to adapt to a new environment. There's risks with that. But on the other hand, there's also risks with staying still, because you stay still and then you end up like the dinosaurs. So this issue goes much deeper than just one or two corrupt administrations, although certainly I've presented evidence to you here of that. So we have a combination of that, plus we just have the combination of the systemic corruption, which is widespread across all governments. And it's not just with psychedelics. Governments are generally conservative about everything. Every new technology, every new development, governments have to be careful with. And the history of human civilization has been a history of new technologies coming about, new weapons, new artistic movements, new forms of media, the internet, and this goes back way earlier than that, printing of books. And all of those have been disruptive technologies, which have challenged authoritarian power structures. And many of these technologies have been advancing democracy, which you might think like, well, democracy is a great thing. If there was a technology that advanced democracy, surely everybody would love it. Not those who are in power. They hate it. Because when you're in power, you're at the very top of the hierarchy, at the top of the pyramid. All the wealth, all the material, all the resources flow to you. So, of course, when you're sitting on top of that, it feels good. It feels like you're on top of the world. And you don't want that system changed in any way. But change is inevitable. So history goes on, and those people usually get overthrown, and they get kicked out of office, they get killed, or eventually they just die off and they're replaced by a newer generation who tends to be more democratic. This is just a trend that we see throughout history. Our culture demonizes psychedelics in many ways. Firstly, in America specifically, I'm talking about, we have had over 50 years of propaganda and misinformation about the scientific and clinical facts about psychedelics. A lot of people just don't know the facts. There's a deep ignorance in our culture about these substances, and a lot of it is simply because few people have actually tried them and have had the direct experience. It's really outrageous that the people who denounce psychedelics the most, and the people who criminalize psychedelics, and the people who do all the drug enforcement, and also all the lawmakers, that they themselves have never actually done psychedelics. They have no direct experience of what they're talking about and what they're demonizing. There's also a missing context in our culture, which I tried to address in part 1 of this series, where we talked about the history of psychedelics, the rich history, and how most religions have strong influences from psychedelics all around the world, all cultures for 10,000 years and even going back further than that, all the way to prehistory, before we even had records. There's a lot of factually incorrect information out there in our culture about psychedelics, about their dangers and risks. There's a lot of myths and urban legends, which I will address later in this episode. There's also this blurring of the line between psychedelics and hard drugs, and people just try to lump them all together, and they think that, well, that's good enough. Psychedelics are just like any other kind of drug. And Leo, if you're just talking about this, what you're doing is you're just justifying your drug use, man. That's all it is. That's all this series is about. It's like you started doing drugs, and now you're just trying to convince yourself, and you're trying to convince others, and trying to convince me that what you're doing isn't drugs, but actually it's drugs. This sort of mentality. And there's a lot of irrational and prejudiced reactions that then come about from this. You have to understand that our schools have been teaching misinformation about psychedelics for the last 50 years. So that's a big deal. That means that several, not even one, but multiple generations now of adults are alive who have been completely misinformed. And they were misinformed at a critical time in their life when they were still developing their minds. So literally they were imprinted and indoctrinated with these ideas about psychedelics. And so now, even when a rational case is presented to them, even when science is presented, even when clinical evidence is presented, they just don't want to listen because their ideas were set ages ago, generations ago. And then they taught that to their kids, and then they taught that to their kids. You see, that's the problem with indoctrination, is that it's this pernicious virus. Let's talk about the double standard of risk and danger that accompanies drugs and psychedelics, because this is a really important point. In the US, psychedelics are mostly all classified as Schedule I substances. This includes LSD, mescaline, MDMA, DMT, and psilocybin. All these are Schedule I, the same as heroin, crack cocaine, and even meth is not Schedule I. Meth is Schedule II, which is a category lower. Schedule I is the worst category. It's considered the most dangerous and the most banned. But this is quite ridiculous, especially when you go to the government website and you read what is the definition of a Schedule I substance. Here's their 3-part definition. This is straight from their website. Firstly, to be called a Schedule I drug, it has to have a high potential for abuse, number 1. Number 2, it has to have no accepted medical treatment or use. And number 3, it has to lack accepted safety standards. So there has to be no safe way in order to use these substances. That's point number 3. All 3 of these points are not valid for psychedelics. They're just scientifically and historically untrue. So let's tackle each one. Is there actually a high potential for abuse with psychedelics? Not if you use them responsibly. Not if you have the proper understanding of what they are, and you know the right dosages, and you are given the right education about how to use them, then there's actually very little evidence that people kill themselves or harm themselves irreparably through taking of these substances. And in fact, I'm going to go a lot more in depth on this topic. I'm going to show you statistics here in a minute and charts that back up what I'm saying here. The second point is that there is no accepted medical treatment or clinical use of these substances. This is just flat out scientifically and clinically untrue. There are studies and there is research and there are actual clinical applications happening right now all over the world with LSD, with MDMA, with psilocybin mushrooms, with ibogaine. These substances are incredibly effective at helping people to deal with depression, with anxiety, with PTSD. Troops coming back from wars like Afghanistan and Iraq are greatly helped by MDMA for overcoming PTSD. This is clinically proven now, and there are, in fact, clinical trials being run right now to make these methods legal in the United States. And I mentioned Rick Doblin with the MAPS program, who's a serious researcher and scientist who is working to introduce these treatments, including LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, and ibogaine for treating all sorts of conditions that I'm talking about here. These substances have been proven to be effective in research for end of life, people who are going through crippling cancer and they know they're going to die. And then these mushrooms, for example, can help them a lot. And of course, as I talked about in part 1, is with addiction. These substances are proven to be extremely effective for treating the worst addictions to opioids, to heroin, to cocaine, to alcohol, to smoking. So this is just flat out false. And the third point is there's a lack of accepted safety standards for using these substances. Well, this is clearly untrue. The psychedelic community has shown that there could be thousands, hundreds of thousands of people using these substances responsibly. Not just that, but also we see historically and also culturally all across the globe, we see societies that actually do accept psychedelics, that do educate their children properly about psychedelics. They have a whole culture around it, like in South America or in Africa. And also throughout history, this was the case in various cultures from Greece and Rome to basically every single continent around the world. And that this was integral to their spiritual life. This was integral to healing themselves and to actually contributing to building a high quality, high consciousness, empathetic society, one that didn't just devolve into hedonistic materialism and consumerism the way that our society is doing today, and all the costs that come from that. Many of those costs people don't even consider as the downside of not doing psychedelics. The 3 most dangerous drugs, you know what those are? Alcohol, tobacco, and opioids, prescription opioids. And the 4th one is antidepressants, which are being sold by the tens and hundreds of millions. Prescriptions are being written all over the world for antidepressants. And they come with all sorts of nasty side effects. You can't even stop antidepressants once you're on them because of the risks of suicide. And they have a whole host of risks, not to mention that they interfere with your hormones, with your whole blood flow system, with all your neurotransmitters. They can also be addictive, and they interfere with your sex drive, all this sorts of nasty stuff, which psychedelics don't do. Let's talk about the statistics here to back up what I'm saying. it's very illuminating to take a look at actual death rates and the top causes of death in the United States and all around the world. So I'm going to be presenting some statistics here for you. I just went and I gathered the most recent and accurate statistics that I could find on death rates for various things. So here's heart disease. In 2016, 633,842 people died from heart disease. 480,000 died from smoking. That's an average. That's not just from 2016, but that's an average that that government statistics cite, an annual average. All of these numbers are going to be annual averages. They don't all come from 2016. Some of these dates are from 2014 or 2015, so they're roughly in the same ballpark, but they're not identical years. From alcohol, we have 30,720 people dying every single year. From prescription opioids, 20,101 died in 2015. From heroin, 12,990 in 2015. From antidepressants, I really wanted to find that statistics, how many people die from antidepressants every year. But that statistic is not readily available because part of the drug statistics is because our culture lumps a lot of these drugs together that we don't always have concrete statistics on death rates for every single type of drugs and every single category of drugs. For car accidents, 35,092 people die every year. From firearms, almost as much, 33,599. How many people do you think die from falling? Just tripping and falling every single year. This is a shocking number. 31,959 people died in 2014 from falling. Now, of course, you have to understand that probably most of those are like old people who have mobility problems or senile or whatever, but still, over 30,000 people die from falling every single year. Puts stuff into perspective. Nearly 5,000 people die from food poisoning every year. 3,536 people die from drowning. 340 people die from ATV accidents. ATVs are all-terrain vehicles. Those like four-wheeler dirt vehicles. 50 people die every year from lightning strikes. 30 people die every year from falling television sets and furniture that tips over. 7 people die every year from playing on playgrounds. Kids, of course. And this is an interesting statistic. How many kids are injured from toy accidents? Now, these aren't deaths, these are just injuries, but still, these are like hospital-reported injuries. 254,200 kids were injured by toys in 2015. Now, what you have to do is you have to put psychedelics into this context. Because if you just say, well, psychedelics can kill people, sometimes people will post on my forum, they'll post articles like, oh, somebody took some mushrooms and then he committed suicide. Yeah, of course that happens. But you have to understand, when we're talking about a population of 330 million people just in the US, a lot of shit happens from very innocent things like toys, playgrounds, TV sets falling over. You see? So what needs to happen is you need to put the psychedelics into context. The trick is that it's very hard to actually find any statistics that are reliable on psychedelic deaths. I did a lot of searching. I actually couldn't find any statistics from any government organizations anywhere in the world about deaths from psychedelics. Like zero, none. They don't really exist. The trouble is that if there are drug statistics, a lot of them are just like drug deaths. But drug deaths, this is a way too broad of a category to tell us anything about psychedelics, because most drug deaths actually result from either legal drugs or prescription medications that have been overused or antidepressants, or heroin or crack or meth. And I'm going to show you some charts here which will show you the top 10 categories of drugs that people die from and overdose from. And psychedelics are not amongst any of those categories. So what that should tell us is that, first of all, we need our government to keep much better statistics on this stuff so that we actually have the science to make informed decisions. That's important. We don't want to be guessing about this stuff. But secondly, what this tells you is that if psychedelic deaths were significant, they would certainly be counted, and they would be much more easier to count. So what this shows us is that realistically, the amount of people who die from psychedelics is extremely low. Extremely low. Like very, 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 very low. Occasionally you might hear a horror story here or there, but you also have to take into account that, what did this person actually consume? Did he consume what he thought he was consuming? Or instead of a psychedelic, did he actually consume some sort of stimulant? Something that was called a psychedelic but actually wasn't. You also have to take into account, did he mix it with alcohol? Did he mix it with weed? Did he mix it with all sorts of other stuff? Did he mix it with antidepressants? When you create these sort of combinations and cocktails of substances, that creates most of the problems with psychedelics. It's very unlikely that a psychedelic by itself would kill you. It's virtually impossible to do that with mushrooms or with LSD, for example. The only way that would happen is if you're taking these mushrooms or LSD, like walking along a cliff or on a rooftop or a balcony, and then you take it and then you jump off. I mean, that could certainly happen, but the substance itself is not going to poison you. It's not going to kill you. That's just not how these substances work. Let's take a look at some of the charts here. So first, what I have for you is a very important chart, which is how scientists rate the addictiveness and the lethality of various drugs. So what you see here is you have the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is depicted the addiction potential of the substance in question, and on the horizontal axis is the lethality of the substance. So of course, in the top corner, we have in red heroin and morphine. These are the really hard, the bad drugs. You want to keep your kids away from those. Highly addictive and also potentially very dangerous due to overdose. Also, up there we have cocaine. Notice we have nicotine and alcohol. Look, those are pretty high. Nicotine is very, very addictive. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances there is. Alcohol has a moderate addiction level, but it's actually one of the most lethal substances. We also have MDMA, which is ecstasy. We're going to have other charts about ecstasy that I'm going to show you here in a minute. Keep that in mind, but remember also that ecstasy or MDMA is not a true psychedelic. It's in its own category. It's technically it's an empathogenic. So keep that in mind as we keep going. That's going to be important. We actually have caffeine there in the middle, and then marijuana there. It has some addiction potential, but very low lethality. And at the very, very bottom, we have the psychedelics. Notice LSD and psilocybin in the bottommost corner. They have the lowest possible addiction potential and the lowest possible lethality. Much lower than nicotine, than alcohol, even than caffeine. And as I'll show you here with other charts, that their risk is even lower than Tylenol. So here is a chart, the next one, that shows us emergency room admissions for various substances. These are not deaths, these are just emergency room admissions. So of course, a lot more of these than deaths. So at the top is we've got opioids, we've got cocaine, we've got sedatives like Xanax, we've got marijuana, we've got antidepressants like Prozac, we've got meth, we've got NSAIDs, which is Tylenol and other pain relievers like that. Then we have ecstasy, MDMA, and at the very, very bottom, we have LSD and psilocybin. Those are the true psychedelics. So much, much lower. Now, of course, you could say, well, Leo, that's because psychedelics aren't very popular. And if they became much more popular, then we'd have a lot more admissions and a lot more deaths. Well, that's an interesting question. That's actually something that needs to be proven and tested. You can't just jump to that conclusion. I mean, certainly, if LSD and psilocybin was legalized and more people were doing it, then you'd have more issues. But also, on the other hand, if they were legalized and there was an education program that went along with it, and also our culture started to think about these substances in the proper way and not stigmatize them, and you were actually taught how to dose them properly, how to use them properly, which substances not to mix them with, then I think that these substances would still be very low on this list. They would still be much less problematic than opioids and cocaine and antidepressants and even Tylenol. Let's go to the next chart. This is a drug overdose death chart for 2014. So here you see at the top heroin, cocaine, OxyContin, Xanax, and so on, going down the list, meth, Vicodin, Valium to the bottom. See? All of these are either prescription drugs or hard drugs, opioids. There's no psychedelics on this list. So what that tells us through inference is that psychedelics would be lower than the lowest on this list, so they would be lower than Valium. So less than 1,700. Because if they were higher, there would be a category for them. The reason there aren't categories for these things, most likely, is because the deaths are so low that they are in the single digits. So if they are reported, they're just like reported as freak accidents, in the same way that you would report deaths for chainsaws. I'm sure a couple of people every year, or maybe even a couple dozen, maybe even a couple hundred, die from chainsaws. But when you're thinking big picture, when you're thinking systemically about how to run an entire culture or entire society, you have to weigh those costs against the benefits of allowing chainsaws, see? So this argument that, oh, well, just because a couple of people die, that now it has to be banned and demonized and criminalized, this is not an argument at all. It's a complete double standard. Because most things, including cars and chainsaws and all sorts of other stuff, even children's toys, come with these risks. You just can't stop it when you're talking about dealing with hundreds of millions of people. Here in this next chart, this is some of the only evidence I found. This is the closest thing I found to psychedelic deaths as a statistic. This comes from the UK. They did a study where they tracked MDMA use and death. And so here what you see is that in 2015, approximately 50, maybe 55 people died in the UK from MDMA. Now, you might say, well, that's a pretty big number, 55 people. And that's in the UK. So if it was in the US, then that number would be significantly larger because we have a lot more of a population here. So that might say that hundreds of people probably die every single year from MDMA in the US. And that might be like a pretty significant statistic. You might say, well, that's reason enough to ban it. But you have to understand something very important about MDMA. First of all, like I said, it's not a true psychedelic. So you can't extrapolate from this and say, well, the same number of people, roughly speaking, like 100 people a year die from mushrooms. That's not at all the case. And secondly, it's especially not the case when you understand that MDMA is notoriously impure. MDMA is used at nightclubs, in raves, music festivals. It's like ubiquitous there. So hundreds of thousands, millions of people take it in the party scene all the time. It's taken by youngsters, a lot of teenagers who go to these raves, people in their early 20s. And the biggest problem with MDMA is that they give you these pills. They hand out these pills at these music festivals. They're consumed with large quantities of alcohol and God knows what else. And these pills are almost never pure. A lot of these pills are not even pure MDMA. A lot of these pills don't even have MDMA in them, even though they give them to you telling you that it's ecstasy, but it's not really ecstasy. It's a much cheaper, dirtier substitute, which has none of the properties of MDMA and also comes with all sorts of side effects and health risks. And when that is consumed and mixed with a bunch of alcohol and God knows what else, weed and everything else, at these raves, these very rowdy sort of social environments with this loud music, it's a totally inappropriate setting. And it's not at all what I'm talking about when I'm talking about responsible psychedelic use for personal and spiritual growth. It's a totally different animal. So from that kind of stuff, we get 100 or 200 people dying every single year. And that makes sense. And just by outlawing it, you're not preventing it anyways, in this case, you see. If you actually made MDMA legal, and if you could go to a pharmacy before you go to the rave and actually pick up some 100% pure MDMA in a properly dosed tablet, you might actually prevent many of these deaths. And also, if you had an education program that put people through some sort of rigorous process where they are taught about dosages, about what happens when you mix substances with alcohol, with weed, and how that potentiates them or even causes potentially lethal combinations when you combine them with antidepressants, the problems that happen there. A lot of people will take psychedelics on antidepressants or MDMA on antidepressants, and that just creates a volatile mix that can result in all sorts of problems. So the key here would be education and also the purity of the substance, because pure MDMA taken at a reasonable dose is not going to kill you. It's only when you do something very irresponsible with it that that happens. And the reason that happens is because people are doing it undercover, in the dark, hiding it, because otherwise they would be stigmatized and they would be criminalized. Here's another chart from that same study from the UK, which compares deaths from tobacco, alcohol, and MDMA. You can see the whopping difference. And that's MDMA. I'm not even considering that as a true psychedelic. On this chart, mushrooms and LSD would be virtually invisible if we plotted those. Here's another chart. This compares the death rates for various substances. It's a chart from Vox. Tobacco, alcohol, prescription painkillers, cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. They listed marijuana as 0 deaths because they actually couldn't find any statistical data for marijuana deaths from just pure overdosing on marijuana. Couldn't find it because it's so rare. It doesn't really happen. In this next chart, this is also data coming from that UK study, which compared, this was a pretty rigorous scientific study that they did in the UK, which tracked drug use over like 10-year period, and it compared all these substances, and then it wanted to list them. And here they're using 2 colors per substance. They got the red color and the turquoise color. The red color is the harm that this substance causes to other people, to society at large. And the turquoise color is the harm that this substance could cause to you personally, to your physical health. So notice that alcohol is number 1, followed by heroin, crack cocaine, meth, regular cocaine. Tobacco is pretty high up on the list. And all the way down at the very other end is we have mushrooms, LSD, and MDMA. Notice that mushrooms and LSD have virtually no red bar, which means that they cause virtually no harm to other people. They can cause some harm to you if you just use them totally irresponsibly. That's an interesting graphic. And the next graphic is the same graphic, the same study, the same data. It's just broken down into very, very fine categories there by different colors. And I'm not going to go through all those colors. If you want, you can look deeper into the slides, into these pictures, and see what all those colors represent. That can be illuminating. And this last slide that I want to show you is poignant for illuminating this stigma that I'm talking about in all these episodes, and why I wanted to shoot these episodes in the first place, because there's a big disparity between what people and our culture thinks about psychedelics, their dangers and their problems, and the reality of it. So this chart perfectly shows that. So what you see here is how scientists rated the danger of these substances versus what people think the dangers of these substances are. So the first thing to note about these charts is that people completely overestimate the danger of most drugs, except for alcohol. Notice that's the only one here that people underestimate. And also notice that alcohol is the most dangerous drug, more dangerous than heroin or cocaine or anything else. That's quite amazing. Most people don't know that. Also notice how low scientists rated the dangers of LSD and mushrooms, the only true psychedelics on this list, and also MDMA is also fairly low. See? Notice now the difference between how scientists rated LSD and mushrooms versus what people rated LSD and mushrooms as far as their danger potential. See? Completely out of whack. Like completely out of whack. That's what I mean by this stigma. This is the problem with telling your parents that you do psychedelics. See, if you tell your mom you're doing psychedelics, she's going to freak out, most likely, if she hasn't done all this research, because she has been taught, and she's just been told to assume that LSD and mushrooms are almost as bad as heroin. And that's what you see on that chart there, is that people think that these psychedelics are almost as bad as heroin. Whereas in reality, they're significantly lower. See, your mom wouldn't freak out if you told her that you're going to a party and you're going to have some shots. She'd be totally cool with that. I mean, if you're an adult. But if you tell her you're going to a party or that you're just going to stay home and do some mushrooms or LSD, she'll freak out. See, that's the stigma. That's the problem. That's what we need to fix, is that people stop thinking that way. And also, if someone in the news, like a celebrity or something, is seen drinking alcohol, taking shots, no one's going to care. But if someone sees them taking some LSD or some mushrooms, then they're going to freak out. Then they might get their career might be damaged from that and so forth. And if a serious person like a scientist or a researcher or an academic comes out and says that they drink alcohol, nobody really cares about that. If they say they smoke, no one cares about that. But if they say that they do LSD or mushrooms, that's it. That's the end of their career. They're stigmatized for life. Now forever, they're that kooky person who does these weird things that are dangerous and that are so bad. That's the stigma that I'm talking about. Now, of course, I don't want to build a one-sided case here for psychedelics. I do acknowledge that there are dangers and there are risks, as with almost anything, when you put it into context. Very often, especially in our culture, these substances are misused. And there's different ways in which they're misused. They are overdosed. They are used in the wrong set and setting. They are used with the totally wrong intentions. They are used in party environments for raves and music festivals. They're combined with alcohol, weed, and antidepressants in dangerous cocktails that should never be combined like that. People, if they were properly taught, they would not do that sort of stuff, or at least they would know better. And access to high-quality, pure psychedelics is quite rare. Most of the psychedelics that are available are the ones that are most suited to partying, and even there, they are very low quality, to the point where you might be getting a 50% dilution of the original thing mixed in with 50% some other kind of crap, or even something totally different than what you were told you're getting. When you're getting LSD, you might not be getting LSD. When you're getting MDMA on the streets, you're probably not getting real MDMA. You have to go out of your way to get the pure substances. This is not just something that you'll find in a pure form in a party setting. So these, of course, create dangers, and a lot of these dangers can be alleviated if we had a sensible drug policy, and also we had removed this stigma that I'm talking about removing, and we had the proper cultural context, which we don't have these days. All of these things, you might, of course, say, well, yeah, Leo, because we don't have them, that's why they should stay illegal. But what I'm saying is that, no, that's backwards. We need to correct the cultural context. We need to educate people about these things. We need to bring science and the clinicians and therapists into this stuff and have them lead the way. And then we can create a culture of responsible psychedelic use, and that would be the much better situation than just demonizing them and sweeping this stuff under the rug. I'm going to post these slides separately that you can download and take a look at through either a PowerPoint or some pictures. So if you want to look at those closer, you can. Now let's address the many different myths that exist around psychedelics. So the first myth is that psychedelics are addictive. This is flat out false. Not only are psychedelics not addictive, they're actually anti-addictive. They cure addiction. They cure heroin addiction, crack addiction, alcohol addiction, and they're very effective for that. You know, the guy who founded AA, I think his name was Bill Wilson. AA was founded on a program of curing yourself of alcohol addiction through LSD and also various psychological and spiritual principles. That was the foundation of AA. And as you saw in these charts, psychedelics are the least addictive of all these substances. Caffeine is more addictive than psychedelics. The next myth is that psychedelics are dangerous. Well, we've shattered that myth here. Yes, there is danger, but as we've seen, the danger is completely within reasonable norms. And if you really want to be concerned about the danger of things, you should be more concerned about the danger of Tylenol and caffeine and tobacco and alcohol than you should be about psychedelics. The other myth is that psychedelics have no legitimate medical uses. That's clearly not true. If you want to go and do the research, you will see that there's a credible scientific evidence showing you these uses. Go to check out maps.org. That's the program which is actually working with the US federal government right now to legalize some of these psychedelics for clinical use under a clinician's supervision. And some of those programs are actually going through the FDA approval process right now. And the results are looking very promising. And so we're anticipating that within the next 10 years, these things will actually be legalized for clinical use, which will be a huge victory, which is coming way too late, but hey, better late than never. Another myth is that psychedelics cause psychosis. This is not true. In very rare situations, what psychedelics can do is they can push a person who is already mentally unstable off the edge. So if you have a history of severe neurosis and psychosis and mental instability, then you probably want to stay away from psychedelics. But this is not an issue for normal, well-functioning human beings. Another myth is that psychedelics cause brain damage. There's no credible evidence of this at all. If you take psychedelics, I've been taking psychedelics now for a whole year, various kinds, you don't feel like your brain is getting slower or like it's getting damaged when you're taking them. And there's just no scientific data to back this up. Psychedelics are a new age fad. That's another myth. This is clearly untrue, as we illustrated in part 1 of this series, where I talked about and showed all the historical and different cultural contexts in which psychedelics have been used. They were not used by hippies in the past. They were used by serious people. They were used by intelligent people. They were used by philosophers. They were used by shaman. They still are to this day. So it's not a new age fad at all. Psychedelics are fun and recreational. That's another myth. They can be, like MDMA especially. And the problem is that people think that they understand psychedelics because maybe they have taken some MDMA or they have heard about MDMA. But MDMA is not a true psychedelic. A true psychedelic will take you deep inside yourself, especially if you don't do it in a party setting. And that's not always a fun experience. It's not always pleasant. Some of the psychedelic experiences I've had are so deep and so profound that I'm not quick to go back and have another hit. I'll wait months. Sometimes I'll wait multiple months just because it's scary to go back. Psychedelics are very, very deep, and you have to be doing a lot of consciousness work. You have to be integrating all this stuff before you really want to go back for a second hit. And we've also seen all across the world different cultures using psychedelics, not just for fun and recreation. They've used it for serious spirituality. They've used it for enlightenment work. They've used it for rites of passage for their teenagers and their young adults. They've used it for healing, various kinds of psychological conditions, addiction, fear, whatever kind of problems exist in their cultures. Another myth is that psychedelics are a slippery slope, which are going to lead to heroin. That's the biggest concern parents have. It's like, oh no, first you're going to do some weed, then you're going to do some mushrooms, then you're going to do some LSD, then you're going to do some DMT, then you're going to go and do some heroin. But the problem there is that you're assuming that all these things are just one type of substance, when we've clearly shown that they're different substances. They're very different chemically. They're very different in the effect they have on your brain. Some of these substances truly are addictive, like alcohol and heroin and crack. But LSD and mushrooms are not. So they're not going to send you flying down that slippery slope, especially if you are properly educated about how to use them. In fact, what they'll do is they will make you a much more responsible individual. You're going to care a lot more about your impact in the world. You're going to tread a lot more carefully. And you're going to start to take your personal and spiritual development a lot more seriously. So you're not going to want to fuck up your life with heroin after you've seen some of the profound spiritual truths that you can see on mushrooms or on LSD or on DMT. Another myth is that psychedelics are just hallucinations, and so that therefore they have nothing to teach you. It's like, oh, Leo, it's just a hallucination. So what could I possibly learn from a hallucination? It's hard to appreciate just how much you could learn from that without actually doing it yourself. This is a point on which you have to just keep an open mind, and you have to acknowledge to yourself that if you've never done it, then you really have no right to criticize it or to judge it. What you need to do is go out and do it, and then come share your thoughts with me. And then tell me that, oh, it's just hallucinations. What people don't appreciate is that what you think of as reality itself might be a hallucination. So what is the true hallucination? What you're experiencing right now, or what you experienced on psychedelics? Now, of course, if you haven't done psychedelics, you'll say, Leo, that's crazy. Of course, what I'm experiencing right now can't possibly be a hallucination. This is real. But that's exactly the problem. And that's exactly why you need a psychedelic, is to show you that you're wrong. And the last myth that I'll talk about here is that serious people don't do psychedelics. There's this idea out there floating around. This is not true. Serious inventors and engineers and artists and philosophers and thinkers and academics and scientists and therapists and clinicians and shaman and spiritual leaders have done psychedelics for thousands of years, and they do it still today. They just do it in the privacy of their own home. They don't talk about it because they know that there's this stigma floating around, so they don't want to make a big splash about it publicly. Maybe they talk about it with one or two of their friends who are very open-minded and are interested in this sort of stuff, but they do it, and they reap huge benefits from it. It's just that you don't hear it being talked about because our culture is extremely low consciousness, and our culture is skewed towards promoting consumerism and just mindless materialism. And of course, in that sort of conversation, there's no room for having any kind of deep, meaningful conversations about the true nature of reality or what psychedelics could reveal to you. And in fact, as soon as you start talking about the truths of psychedelics to ordinary people, they start to think you're crazy. It's not that you're crazy, or it's not that psychedelics make you crazy. It's that our culture is crazy. It's so shallow and so mindless that when you start talking about deep issues about reality with people, they don't even know how to make sense of that sort of stuff. This is a real fault of our culture. And over time, our culture will simply have to evolve into this. It's not really a choice. Our culture is evolving towards higher and higher consciousness. You're not going to stop it. You can resist it. You could cling to your old values and traditions, but you're not going to stop it. This is a longer term trend. This is a trend that's been happening for thousands of years, and it certainly isn't over now because of some silly drug war. So let's talk about why this stigma exists. The stigma around psychedelics exists because psychedelics threaten culture, science, religion, politics, business and industries like Big Pharma and the military-industrial complex. Notice that all of these social structures are all about protecting a status quo. Even science. Science is very defensive and tends to be very ideological and dogmatic when it comes to defending itself, just like religion, just like politics, just like business, just like big industries, just like culture at large. All of these systems are predicated upon holding firm beliefs about the nature of reality. And what psychedelics do is that they make you question these beliefs. They flip these things inside out, and they melt your notions of conventional reality. They make you question things like, what am I doing with my life? What's healthy? What's unhealthy? What's fair? What's unfair? Why do we have this kind of government? Why am I going to work this 9-to-5 job, this mindless job? Why am I just chasing money? Why am I chasing sex? Why am I involved with this industry? Why am I part of the military-industrial complex? Why am I inventing weapons to kill people? Why am I participating in these polarized partisan politics of bickering back and forth between the left and the right and the alt-right and the social justice wars and all this kind of nonsense? Why is all this going on? Why am I part of this? They start to make you see the nonsense of all this. Psychedelics also make you radically open-minded, which is very threatening to everyone else around you, because when you open your mind to radical new possibilities and you start to really develop yourself and grow, it's very threatening to everybody else. You would think that others would be happy for you, but no, they're not, because their entire reality is based upon these belief systems. They have all these firm beliefs about who they are and what their country is and how business should be and what family is all about and what religion is all about and what life is all about. And all of these happen to be a house of cards. And so, in a sense, the most threatening thing to the status quo, to this house of cards, to this illusion, is truth. The devil is scared to death of the truth, because the truth will rub him out. Like literally, the devil is dissolved by the light of truth. And that's what psychedelics move us towards. And that's exactly why we need more psychedelics, not less. But of course, that means that is sort of a rough adjustment, because there's this tug of war going on within you, but also within our society at large, between selfishness and selflessness, between ego and between truth, between the devil and between God. This struggle is going on inside of you and outside of you. And if you've been doing consciousness work and personal development work, and maybe moving a little bit towards enlightenment, then you have felt this tension within you, and it's hard. It's hard to walk this tightrope between these two forces. There's a lot within our culture that's going to distract you. And that's by design. It's not an accident. That's by design. See, the devil has infested all these systems very carefully. And by devil, I mean the ego. Both the individual ego and the collective ego. Another reason that we have this stigma is that psychedelics turn people into liberals. That's a fact. You're not going to be able to stay a conservative while you're doing psychedelics. It's not going to happen. What psychedelics will reveal to you is that all your conservative, well, maybe not all, but many of your conservative positions are just that. They're ideological positions, and they will melt before the light of truth. And that could be a good thing, could also be a negative thing for you, because if you're very attached to your conservative positions, it's going to be a problem. See, what psychedelics do is they remove boundaries. That's what truth is. Truth is the absence of all boundaries. That means there's no more boundaries between us and them, me and other, reality and hallucination. All these boundaries get blurred. because they weren't there in the first place. They were artificial. They were conceptual. And what this makes you do is this makes you have a deeper concern for the well-being of everything. You become much more holistic in your perspective on life. You have a more global concern. You no longer just care about your state, your political party, your country, your family, your ideology, your religion. You care about everybody. And this rubs many conservatives the wrong way because they think, well, Leo, that turns me into a liberal. That's what those bleeding heart liberals are all about. Yeah, those liberals are more evolved than you. I'm not just saying that because I'm a liberal. This is just something you're going to discover as you do conscious work. The more conscious you become, the more liberal you will become. Now, I'm not saying that every silly thing that liberals believe is true. That's not what I'm saying at all. Actually, you will become much more radical than your average liberal. Because what psychedelics do is they make you selfless and compassionate. That's an inherent part of pursuing truth is as you pursue the truth, you must shed layer upon layer upon layer of your ego, all of your identifications to country, to political party, to whatever. You have to shed all of those such that really you're going hyper liberal because you have to even shed all your liberal ideologies, all your liberal beliefs, all your liberal identifications. You become so liberal you stop thinking of yourself as a liberal. Because a lot of liberals, they're still very selfish. They're still very ideological. And that prevents them from going to the next level. And this is what spiral dynamics is about. I've talked about this model in the past, and it's extremely applicable to what we're talking about right now. Because another way to look at why there's this stigma against psychedelics is if you're a student of spiral dynamics and you know that model, then we've got stage blue, stage orange, stage green. Then we have tier 2, which is now stage yellow and stage turquoise. Stage yellow and turquoise is a very small percentage of society, less than 1%. And this is where you get into tier 2, where you really get higher levels of consciousness and you get a really widening of your concern because you're becoming less selfish. So you have a much broader, much more global perspective on the world. Stage blue is the stage which is very bureaucratic and you might say traditional, conservative, or religious. Then you have stage orange, which moves away from that and it's very success-oriented, me-oriented, science-oriented, and technology-oriented and materialistic. It's like hyper-materialistic, pursuing materialism without any limit. And then after that, you got stage green, which is all the traditional classical hippies and new agers and the people who like free love and go to gatherings and music festivals and smoke a bunch of pot. But then you go beyond green to yellow and to turquoise, see? So right now in our country, what we have is we have this clash between stage green and stage blue, fighting in the midst, and also orange is in the middle. But really what our society is about is it's just corrupted and infested with stage orange. Corrupted and infested with materialism. And so each one of these stages, as you can remember from spiral dynamics, it resists growing to the next stage. What spiral dynamics tells you is that as you evolve your consciousness, as you become more personally developed, you're moving up these stages. And that it's a linear progression. You're not going to jump over stages. But what will happen is you will resist every single transition. So if you're at blue right now, you're going to resist orange. If you're at orange, you're going to resist green. If you're at green, you're going to resist going yellow and so on. And that's just natural. That's just homeostasis. This happens both individually within you, but also happens collectively. We're seeing this play out collectively right now in our politics and in our culture. And that's what all these cultural wars are about. And what psychedelics will do is that they will dissolve all these stages and they will move you all the way towards turquoise. If you want to think of it this way, a powerful psychedelic like DMT is like pure powdered stage turquoise. You want to know what stage turquoise feels like? Take some DMT, and that's what you got. It's such a radical state of consciousness that it cannot even be conceived at stage green or orange or blue. Like, it's a totally different reality. We're talking about a totally different reality, even though it basically stayed the same, but your perspective on everything changes so radically that it's like you're living in a different world. Your politics change, your behaviors change, like everything changes. Like, it changes so much, it's ridiculous. And that's what we're moving you towards with all this self-actualization business. So of course, psychedelics hasten that, but also that's precisely why it's resisted. So now you understand why it's resisted. And the other reason we have this stigma is because psychedelics, honestly, they are misused. I read a lot of trip reports from foolish people who use these psychedelics in foolish ways. I read reports or messages on my forum about people experimenting with them and just doing the stupidest things, ignoring the most basic protocols because they haven't done their research. They don't take these things seriously. They think that they're just toys. And then some of them experience bad trips. And that's another reason why we have this stigma, is because, yeah, you can have some bad trips, some harrowing experiences on these substances. But that's actually not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That's a good thing because that shows you how screwed up and dysfunctional your psyche is. If you're having a lot of bad trips, you got a lot of growing to do. And those bad trips are actually part of your growth process. Not a bad thing at all. A couple of bad trips for some of our politicians and some of our leaders would be just the right medicine to give them the kind of humility and compassion that they need to have if they need to be leading a nation of over 300 million people. And this demonization business is not something new. It's not something original to the US or to the 20th century. There's been a long history of it throughout history. Think about the persecution of witches by the church. That was a thing. Witches were persecuted for hundreds of years. And witches are not a myth. Witches are real. Witchcraft is real. It's been persecuted precisely because it's a threat to Orthodox Christianity. That's why Christians are so freaked out by witchcraft. That's what the ego does to anything that threatens its status quo. How about the Spanish explorers, the conquistadors that came and conquered the Aztecs, decimated the Aztecs and the Mayan populations of Mexico and the Americas? The Aztecs had a rich tradition of mushroom ceremonies, using mushrooms for spiritual purposes. And one of the first things the Spanish explorers did when they came here is they put a lid on that thing, and they persecuted the Aztecs for that. Because, of course, for the same reason. Their Orthodox religion was threatened by that. The Catholic missionaries in Africa also did the same thing with the Bwiti tribe that I talked about in episode part 1, who used the iboga plant. They also tried to demonize iboga and tried to really eliminate it from their culture. But then the Bwiti fought back, and now they're still using it. In fact, actually, it's been legalized for them to use in that part of the world. And there's a lot more of these examples. Many of these probably weren't even well documented in history, because simply history is a collection of orthodoxy. So all the unorthodoxy that's stamped out doesn't get recorded in history. They don't teach it to you in school or in the history books. What this is, from a larger perspective, is this is a battle between the exoteric and the esoteric. The exoteric is all the materialistic stuff, all the material trappings of religion. It's all the ideology, the beliefs, the rituals, all the stuff we don't like about religion, all the stuff that atheists move away from. And the esoteric is actually the true spiritual mystical kernel that actually was the inspiring source for all the exoteric. But the people who are engrossed in the exoteric, all the orthodoxy, they are so engrossed in that precisely because it's a great distraction from going inside and accessing the truth, which is esoteric. So the esoteric is constantly being demonized and is being suppressed by the exoteric. And what's really sad now in the 21st century is that this now is not happening through some Spanish Inquisition. It's happening through commerce, through business, through the shallow materialism of stage orange, spiral dynamics consciousness, which is just really taking over the whole globe. It's hard to escape it these days, no matter what country you go to. Even in the East, it's taking over in China and Japan and other places like that. They're becoming highly commercialized, highly exoteric, to the point where we're really getting disconnected from what life is about, which is growth, which is about connecting to existential truths, which can only be accessed esoterically and not exoterically. That's why we have all these people who are on opioids, on prescription antidepressants, who are on alcohol and tobacco. Suicide rates are through the roof. We have all these mass murders and killings and terrorism and all this stuff. What is all this? This is the excesses of exotericism backfiring on itself. And the lesson from all this to be drawn is, hey, dummy, look inside, turn inwards. Esoteric is what you want, turn inwards. The solutions are all inside, and psychedelics can be a catalyst to help you with that. So what's the solution to this psychedelic dilemma that we're facing? Well, I think it's legalization. Do I think all drugs should be legalized, including heroin and crack cocaine? No, I think that's probably going a little too far. I don't think we need to legalize heroin and crack cocaine and meth. Some of these are pretty nasty drugs that should not be available at the pharmacy. But as far as mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, and others like that, these should definitely be legalized. They have way less risk than many other things which are perfectly legal. I think what we need is not only legalization, but actually we need funding from our government. We need leadership and funding of science and research into these substances. One of the greatest shames that happened with this drug war is that not only were these substances outlawed for consumers, but they were also mostly outlawed for researchers and clinicians. And there's still so much more about this field we can learn. It's one of the most remarkable frontiers of science that almost no one ever talks about. We haven't even scratched the surface of all the psychedelic substances that could be found out in nature and that could also be synthesized chemically in the laboratory. And we don't even have a clue as to what the full potential is here. These substances could have remarkable cures for all sorts of ailments that we have, and we could potentially find much more powerful psychedelics that could have even greater consequences for our spiritual development. We don't know. So what we need is a lot of investment and money into this sort of stuff, like the MAPS program that Rick Doblin is running. And what is promising, though, is that more and more research is starting to come online. In the last 10 years, the government has sort of loosened its grip on this ban on research. And so we're seeing more and more of this happen in the US and also around the world, which is very promising. Because the more research that comes in, the more amazed we are at what we find. And actually, this is going to be important for understanding artificial intelligence. It's going to be important for understanding how consciousness happens, where it comes from, what does it mean, what is the connection between brain cells and neurons and consciousness and different states. So this is a really exciting field. And what we should really be doing is embracing it, funding it, and then what I would really like to see as a solution, the ultimate solution to this whole issue, is that we need a high-quality education campaign which is truthful and based on science and research within our school systems. Stop all this negative propaganda and demonization. And what I would like to see as far as how people could legally use psychedelics is as follows. I would like to see a program like an online course, maybe a 10 or 20 hour online course that anybody could go and take in the comfort of their own home. They pay some amount of money. If they take this course, they can get a certificate, which is a license for using psychedelics. In this course, they will be taught about all the stuff I talked about here and much more. They will be taught about the history, the scientific evidence, the clinical uses. They will be taught about all the risks and all the dangers. They will be taught about dosages, how to distinguish different substances, how to weigh them, how to consume them, proper methods, proper protocols. All of this will be drilled into you. Then you will go to a local center, like a DMV sort of thing, but for psychedelics, like a little clinic there, run by the government. They will give you an exam, like a DMV exam for driving your car. You will take that exam. You make sure that you know all the safety protocols for that. And then what they do is they give you some psychedelics of your choice. You get to trip there in a safe room with them. They get to watch you, make sure that you're cool. You go through a few of those experiences while you're being monitored to make sure you're doing it all safely and properly. You get your bearings straight, and then you get this license, and this license allows you to go to a pharmacy and to purchase LSD, mushrooms, mescaline, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, this sort of stuff, and then you can use it legally and responsibly at home. And I think that would be the most sensible solution. And then lots of people could start using it responsibly, and also educating those folks who go to raves and all that and misuse these substances. Then there'd be a better support system for those sorts of settings, and should actually reduce the risks and the dangers that come from that, which is very rampant right now. Drug culture, party culture, nightclubs. I live here in Las Vegas. It's a town full of party drugs. So, and people are getting hurt by them just because they're not being properly educated and they don't have access to the pure substances that they easily could. What's really cool is how this field will develop in the next 50 to 100 years. I think that society is going to be blindsided by some of these developments in the next 50 to 100 years. Governments are not just going to be able to put a lid on this thing the way they have been forever. That's not going to fly. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a growing and sort of bubbling underground community. There already is. It's already existed for a long time, but now, just in the last 5 or 10 years, it's been bubbling more and more. Psychedelic conferences are being held around the world. Serious researchers and academics are putting their name to some of these studies and doing this sort of research. People are coming out and talking about the amazing benefits that they've experienced in their own lives. So all this is really good stuff. And what we're going to see is a major revolution. People these days are very well aware of the internet revolution and the social media revolution, the technological revolutions, the cell phone revolution. That's technology. And there will, of course, be much more technology. But what's really interesting is this psychedelic technology, which has been laying there dormant for the last 50 years and has just been suppressed. And what could happen when this technology is fully unleashed, with groundbreaking research being done and new substances being synthesized and carefully tested to make sure that they're safe, and then education and changing our culture? That could be a huge thing. This could be a huge boon for society. And a lot of new scientific developments could happen here. Another thing that people don't really appreciate about psychedelics is how much more creative they make you, how many deep insights they can give you about not only your own life, but in the advancement of human civilization within science, within technology, and inventions of all sorts, and within art. So we could have like a renaissance if this is done properly. Now, of course, the dangers is doing it the way the hippies did it in the 1960s, which is that everyone just goes crazy with psychedelics, and it's done very irresponsibly, and it's just done in this very idealistic sort of utopian manner of like, oh yeah, all the world's problems will be solved by psychedelics. No, that's not what I'm saying here. You still need to get the right education. You still need to do consciousness work. You still need to do personal development work. So you still need to read books. You still need to do all the other stuff. But this can be a catalyst. Just, like with anything, you need to strike the right balance. The hippies in the 1960s, they swung the pendulum too much to one direction, and then we swung it quickly back in the other direction, and both directions are wrong. There's a balance somewhere in the middle. Like certain cultures have demonstrated in the past who have used it effectively. That's something we could learn from if only we were open-minded and willing to let go of certain preconceived notions that we have, and we're just open to change. A lot of this is just being open to change. A lot of personal development is just being open to change. You think you want change, but a lot of people, they only want change as lip service. They don't realize the full cost of change. Cost is challenging. I mean, change is challenging. It's emotionally laborious. It can be scary. But then again, you can't prevent it even if you tried. You can only stall it for a little while. That's what we see throughout history, is that we see conservatism, it's a strong force, but progress is a stronger force. It always wins out. That's what evolution is about. That seems to be a fundamental feature of consciousness, is that it wants to evolve. It wants to spread. It wants to diversify. It doesn't like being solidified and bottled up with authoritarian power structures. See, all those tend to break down. There's this equalizing, egalitarian, democratic quality to consciousness. Because the only reason you would want to bottle something up or cling to it or solidify it is because you're uncomfortable with change. But everything is changing. Your body is changing and you're going to die. So this game of playing this rigid self, this game is not going to win. It's a fundamentally unwinnable game. You always lose that game. It's only a question of how long will you hold on and how much suffering will you create in that clinging process, which is largely unnecessary. It's a self-inflicted wound. So if you're suffering in your life or you see your culture suffering, you can kind of put that into perspective and understand why this is happening, why there are these tensions, why it seems so difficult. In a sense, it's very difficult, but in another sense, it's actually very easy if you would just let go and surrender and have some humility and have some openness and just kind of be willing to explore and set truth and consciousness as your number one priority, above your ego, above your materialistic cravings and all that. Our society right now is drowning in meaninglessness and spiral dynamics stained orange. There is a incredible potential to self-actualize the entire human race. And this potential has never existed the way that it does right now and the way that it has for the last 50 years. Really, we have the magic pill to enlighten every single human being on the planet. We have it right now. 30 milligrams of 5-MeO-DMT up your nose will show you the truth. And one of the most amazing things and why I love psychedelics so much is because they are so objective. We can take spirituality, we can take religion, and we can throw away all the bullshit that comes with it, all the stuff the ego has corrupted it with. And we can show people, scientific, atheistic, agnostic, religious, whatever, we can show them what spirituality is all about with a very methodical, clinical, precise process. I see a world in the future where maybe 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, a child is born and they do not get to graduate elementary school without doing 30 doses of 5-MeO-DMT. So by the time that they graduate elementary school, they have access to the deepest, most profound truths in all of existence already. And then based on that foundation, they can go and learn and do everything and become well-functioning members of society. And then based on top of that, we can build an entire society. But you don't let a human being be a human being without trying 5-MeO-DMT. That's what's going to happen in the future. In the same way that with self-driving cars, In 20 years, in 50 years, you're not going to be able to drive your own fucking car because you can't be trusted. Because people drive drunk and people drive texting. This is not going to fly. It's too dangerous. The only reason we tolerate it now is because there's no better alternative, but that's going to change quickly. The same thing is going to happen with these psychedelics. We have that ability right now. We're really on the cutting edge. People do not appreciate what special time this is that we're alive in right now. In a sense, every era is a special time. There's always something happening. There's always a new revolution. And I hate it when people say, oh, right now is like we're in some special time. But in another sense, we're really in a special time with psychedelics. This is a technology that human society, if we survive, will look back on this in 100 years and 500 years. They will look back and they will see what barbarians we were and just how blind and ignorant we were with our attitudes towards psychedelics in the 20th and the 21st century. They're going to be blown away by this because for them, it's just going to be the new normal. Everyone snorting 500, that's going to be the new normal. And you will really appreciate that when you try it for yourself. So everything I said here, it's all good theory. It's all good talk. Whether you like it or not, these statistics, you might think I'm just justifying and rationalizing. That is the case. These are just rationalizations, justifications. What you got to do is go try it yourself. That's the ultimate solution. Try it yourself and see what's up. And then if you still disagree with me, then come back and we'll talk about the disagreements. But try it responsibly. Try it in a non-party setting. Try it with a serious intent to grow your own consciousness. Try it with an open mind. Try it with the intention to surrender fully to whatever is revealed to you and to not bring your own prejudices and preconceptions into the experience. And then I think you'll be in for a pleasant or maybe a rude awakening. Depends on how you hold that stuff. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please remember to click that like button for me and come check out Actualized.org. This is my website. I've got my blog. I'm posting new stuff there. I'm going to post a list of the dangers and risks of psychedelics. I'm going to actually have a link down below to that post because I want to be fair and accurate about this. I don't like when people present a one-sided, like, polemical case about a topic. I like to get all the sides. So there are some risks and dangers, and you can go read up on those on my blog. Check out the forum. A lot of people post their trip reports on the forum, which is cool. I love reading trip reports on the forum, so post away there. And the Life Purpose course, the book list, and stick with me for more deep topics to come.